All right, welcome everyone. My name is Rabbi Zach Truboff. I am coming to you from Yerushalayim. So I guess good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be. Today's shiur that I'm doing as part of the Yemei Iyun is a look at the Korban Pesach, right? The original Korban Pesach, Pesach Mitzrayim. And we're going to be looking at that original Korban Pesach through the lens of viewing it as an act of liberation. That it is not just an act of worship, it is actually a revolutionary, a radical moment for the Jewish people in which they declare their freedom. So to get at this, we're actually going to look through both secular philosophers and rabbinic texts, but I want to begin with what I assume is probably a first in the history of the YCT's Yemei Iyun, L'Tanach. And I want to begin by reading an excerpt from the writings of the great German philosopher, 19th century philosopher, Hegel. Hegel was the greatest German philosopher of his time, and his influence is still felt throughout philosophy and culture. And one of his primary concerns was the idea of freedom. And specifically, how is it that human beings have come to grasp the true nature of freedom as one looks throughout the progression of history? That for Hegel, human history is a progression towards freedom, though he has very complex ideas about what that might mean. Just to give you one example of how important the idea of freedom was to Hegel, he made a point of celebrating the French Revolution when it took place. He was about 19 years old at the time. Because he saw it as a significant turning point in humanity's attempt to liberate itself from structures of oppression. It was a very joyous and supposedly celebratory moment for Hegel and some of his friends, because they saw it as a very, very big deal, because it signaled freedom to the world. And perhaps the most famous section of his greatest philosophical work, the Phenomenology of Spirit, it focuses on this very famous relationship, a dialectical relationship between masters and slaves. So again, freedom is something Hegel thought a lot about. Slavery is something Hegel thought a lot about. And even though he was a philosopher, he often turned to religious themes and texts to develop his philosophical insights. And in one of his early essays, he offers a very interesting analysis of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Jewish people's exodus from Egypt. Now, if you're a philosopher and you are concerned with the idea of freedom, the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim is a logical place to turn, because it is, without question, one of the paradigmatic texts of Western culture around ideas of emancipation and liberation. And for this reason, Yetziat Mitzrayim has served as inspiration for many oppressed peoples, as you all probably know. One of the classic examples as Americans, where people are often familiar with, is that for Blacks suffering under slavery in America, the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim was very, very important, and it infused their own understanding of their experience. And what was particularly important is that the narrative made clear that oppression is not the natural order of things. God cares about the suffering of the oppressed, and that it's only a matter of time until evil pharaohs are put in their place and the structures of oppression come crashing down and slaves can go free. But Hegel didn't quite see Yetziat Mitzrayim in that fashion, as this beautiful model of going from slavery to freedom. He was, in fact, much more critical of it. And what he sees is not a narrative of liberation, but rather a story of a ragtag group of slaves who had to be dragged kicking and screaming out of Egypt by Moshe and by God. The Jewish people did not do a whole lot, if anything, in the Exodus narrative to earn their freedom. And as a result, even after leaving Egypt, Hegel argues that they're not really free at all. Now, on this point, Hegel is clearly influenced by Christian readings of the Torah, which tend to emphasize the negative behavior of the Jewish people in order to anticipate the fact that God will later break his covenant with the Jews in order to redeem humanity through Jesus. So again, Christian interpretation often sort of makes the Jews look as bad as possible. But even given Hegel's harsh treatments of the Jewish people in the Exodus narrative, which we'll see in a moment, we still have to ask ourselves, is he wrong? Does Yetziat Mitzrayim end with the Jewish people's freedom? And again, I assume people here are familiar with the books of Shemot and Bamidbar and the rest of the Chumash. And if you know those books, you see that the Jewish people do not necessarily relish having left Egypt. It's quite the opposite. They seem to yearn for their previous life of slavery, even after they've left Egypt, even after they've left Egypt far behind. And this is hardly the behavior of a people that has achieved their freedom, that if we want to imagine the Exodus as being about that. In reading Hegel, the first thing we also got to know is that he is an astute reader of the biblical text, and he notices things, I have to be honest, that I didn't even notice until he pointed them out. First, he notes that the Jewish people's liberation does not begin with the communal groundswell of people yearning for freedom. But there's no mention in the Torah of the Jewish people doing anything other than cry out from the pain of their sufferings. Right? That's all we're really told about the Jews before Moshe is sent to liberate them. This fact is important for Hegel because it explains something significant when God first sends Moshe to tell them of their coming redemption. So here's how Hegel opens. It's from an essay, The Spirit of Christianity, an early essay of his. He says, when Moses, an isolated enthusiast for the liberation of his people, came to the elders of the Israelites and spoke to them of his project, the project being God's project of liberation, his divine calling found its legitimation not in heartfelt hatred of oppression, not in a longing for air and freedom, but in certain tricks which Moses baffled them, and which were performed subsequently with equal skill by Egyptian conjurers. The deeds of Moses and Aaron worked on their brethren precisely as they did on the Egyptians, as a force, and we see, meaning a force like a power, a greater strength. And we see how the latter defended themselves, the Egyptians defended themselves against subjection by just the same means. Now, for a people, the Jewish people who were suffering, but still yearning for freedom, if that's what was really going on in the narrative, you would imagine they would have been overjoyed when Moshe shows up. Here he is, a Jew who's lived his life free, never having felt the sting of the whip on his back, and he's come to them promising to lead them out to freedom. Right? This is what revolutions are often waiting for. They need a leader like Moshe with the courage to stand up, to unite the people, to speak truth to power. They need a leader who can do these things. So isn't he the one they've been waiting for? However, it's not Moshe's message of freedom that convinces the Jewish people. Right? Hegel notes this. Right? It's the magic tricks he performs. It's the miracles. Right? The putting his hands in and showing that he has tzara'at, that he has leprosy. These otot, these signs that God has given him. It's these miracles that show that he speaks for a higher power. And if the people are going to follow Moshe, it's clear that in large part, it will be not because they yearn for their freedom, but because they believe that Moshe represents a power that is more powerful than Pharaoh. In fact, it's not only the Jews who see their liberation as a fight to show who's the most powerful, right? It's the Egyptians as well. The way they deny the legitimacy of Moshe's claims, the claims that Moshe brings to Pharaoh, that the Jewish people must be sent free, is by proving that he and his God are no more powerful than they. Right? Pharaoh's sorcerers can reproduce Moshe's magic tricks. And the reason this is so important for Hegel is that it shows that neither the Jews nor the Egyptians are functioning under a logic where freedom has any meaning. Right? If you look at it this way, there's no fight about freedom in the Exodus story. Rather, it's really a fight about who will submit to the most powerful authority. And the only question is whether the greater power is God or Pharaoh. Right? That's Hegel's point. The fact that the Jews did not yearn for freedom is also made clear in the way that they respond to Moshe's attempt to free them. As you know, Moshe's first intervention with Pharaoh fails miserably. Not only does Pharaoh refuse to let them out at all, but he increases the suffering of the Jews. And Hegel notes how the Jews respond, right? The increased hardships consequent upon Moshe's discourse in Pharaoh's presence did not act as a stronger stimulus to the Jews, meaning Moshe's intervention does not give the Jews any hope, but only intensified their sufferings. It just made things worse. Against no one were the Jews more enraged than Moshe, whom they cursed, right? When Moshe fails, the people don't get angry at Pharaoh. They don't get angry at the Egyptians, right? Who are the real oppressors here. They get angry at Moshe, right? Instead of condemning Pharaoh as evil and wicked for further oppressing them, they take out their anger on Moshe. And again, this doesn't look like a people that is yearning and willing to fight for their freedom. And throughout the whole narrative, from the beginning of Shemot until Kriyat Yamsuf, Moshe and Aaron are the only ones fighting and risking everything to free the people. And that's what Hegel notes. He says here, Moshe alone takes action. He's the active force here. He's the one who's active. The people, the Jewish people, are completely passive, right? Doesn't look like they're really aspiring to freedom. And Hegel actually makes one more ironic point here. As you know, the basic pattern of the Makot is that the plagues is that a plague is sent. Pharaoh relents and decides to allow the Jewish people to leave. Moshe rescinds the plague, and then Pharaoh changes his mind and reneges on his promise. However, what Hegel notes is that when Pharaoh reneges on his promise, God won't even let Pharaoh act freely in his defiance. Instead, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. We all know this, right? God makes Pharaoh be the one who refuses to let the Jewish people go. That is why he stands up to God, Pharaoh, because God makes him. God hardens his heart. And this really bothers Hegel because, again, we would expect Pharaoh at least to be free in his defiance. And that's not even the way that the story plays it out here. For Hegel, Yitziat Mitzrayim isn't really a story about freedom at all. It's about dominance. It's about God showing his dominance to the Jews and to the Egyptians. And part of the way that dominance is made clear is by showing that no one can stand up to God. And even when it appears like Pharaoh is doing that, it's simply God taking away Pharaoh's free will and causing him to refuse. So how could any of this ever really be a story about freedom at all? And in the next part here, again, he emphasizes, Hegel, the passivity of the Jewish people. They do not fight for their freedom. Instead, they're bystanders watching God inflict suffering upon their Egyptian masters. Right? Hegel says here, for the Jews, a great thing was done, but they do not inaugurate it with heroic deeds of their own. It is for them that Egypt suffers the most diverse plagues and misery. Right? Hegel notes that the Jewish people don't even seem to willingly leave Egypt, even after all the plagues. He says here, and again, he's quoting a verse. He says, amid general lamentation, they withdraw, driven forth by the hapless Egyptians. And what he's implicitly highlighting here is the verse from Shemot, V'techazak Mitzrayim ala'am, lemaher l'shalcham mina aretz. Basically, that the Egyptians push the Jewish people out quickly from the land of Egypt. Now, we think the Jews left in a hurry because they wanted to leave, right? Right? They wanted to get out of there. But here, the Torah seems to imply that it was as much because the Egyptians were pushing them out as anything, right? And that's the dimension that Hegel highlights. The Jews almost had to be forced out of slavery, forced out of Egypt. And in the next line, Hegel offers perhaps his harshest critique. He says, but they themselves, the Jews, have only the malice the coward feels when his enemy is brought low by someone else's act, right? The Jews vanquish, they defeat the Egyptians, but they haven't battled. The Egyptians are conquered, but not by their enemies. They are conquered like men murdered in their sleep or poisoned by an invisible attack. And the Israelites, with the sign on their houses and the profit which all this misery brings, look like the notorious robbers during the plague at Marseille. So again, Hegel says it very clearly here. The Jews in leaving Egypt are cowards. God is the one who strikes down the oppressors. All the Jewish people do on the way out is the one thing that Moshe asks of them, which is, as Hegel says here, the only act which Moses reserved for the Israelites was on the evening which he knew to be the last one, on which they would speak to their neighbors and friends to borrow with deceit and repay confidence with theft. And what Hegel is referring to is the idea that the Jews had to go to their Egyptian neighbors and ask for gold and silver. And that was part of, like, you can understand it as their payment for back wages, so to speak. So they're going to take this wealth out with them. But what Hegel again notes here, and again, he's reading the text accurately, is that the Torah does use a language of borrowing, right? They don't even go to their neighbors and take the wealth, the gold and the silver by force. They simply borrow with the intention of never giving it back, which again is the sort of coward's way of acting. And this is based on the verse, V'yish'alu mimitzrayim kesef uchlei zahav. Right? They're asking from them, they're borrowing from them. They're not taking it because it's theirs, because they deserve it, because they've earned it, right? They're sort of saying, please, can we just borrow it with the intention of never giving it back? Now, one can see when you look at all this, how Hegel's critiques of the Jews being slave-like, cowardly, and deceitful reflect many anti-Semitic stereotypes. And it would be correct to acknowledge that. But it is also true that Hegel has a point, because like us, he has read the rest of the Torah. He knows that the Jewish people don't act free even after leaving Egypt. And he writes here, I'll just conclude, it is no wonder that this nation, with its emancipation, bore the most slave-like demeanor, regretted leaving Egypt, wished to return there again whenever difficulty or danger came upon it in the sequel. Whenever everything bad happens to the Jews in the desert, they want to run back to Egypt. And thus showed how in its liberation, the Jewish people had been without the soul and the spontaneous need of freedom, right? The Jews, again, we see there's no freedom here. There's no real liberation here because all they want to do is go back to Egypt. And even after they leave Egypt, they don't really show any desire for real freedom. Now, perhaps the clearest example of this can be seen right after the Jews leave Egypt. Instead of experiencing it as a moment of triumph and gaining new confidence in their abilities as a free people when they arrive at the Red Sea, what happens is once they get out of Egypt, they're at the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, the Egyptian army is at their backs. You'd expect this, maybe they'll finally stand up for themselves, right? They're free now. They've shown they can do it, right? But instead they crumble. They say to Moshe, what have you done? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Why did you have to bring us out here to die? And again, it does not look like the personality of a free people. Ibn Ezra, who is not a Hegelian, but he notes Hegel's exact point in his commentary on this, that even after leaving Egypt, the Jewish people are not free. And the sources are a little different than the order than in the source sheet, but source 2 here, the Ibn Ezra, he says, one can question how it is possible that a great encampment of 600,000 people would fear those pursuing them. Meaning, whatever the size of the Egyptian army, the encampments of the Jewish people at Yam Suf, it far outnumbers, it vastly outnumbers it. 600,000, that's just the men. Why? I mean, you can imagine an army of that size is almost unimaginable, right? That to have that many people that the Egyptians are going to have to fight. Why would they, the Jews, not fight for themselves and their children, right? If there's any moment the Jews are going to stand up for themselves, it should be here. And the answer, Ibn Ezra says, is because Egyptians were the masters of Israel. And the generation which had left Egypt learned from their youth to suffer the yoke of Egypt, and its spirit was lowly. How could they now fight against their masters? And Israel was weak and not trained in war. So what Ibn Ezra is noting here, and it's an insight that Hegel wrote incessantly about, both in what we just saw and in other parts of his writings, is that freedom is not simply a question of political arrangements. Freedom isn't achieved by just breaking the chains of the slave. Freedom has a psychic component, and that's perhaps its most significant feature. When you're a slave, you must listen to the master. Now, we often assume that slaves submit because the alternative means death for the slave, right? The master has the power and will make the slave suffer. But what Ibn Ezra notes is that even when the slave has the power, as is the case at the banks of the Red Sea, where the Jews greatly outnumber the Egyptians, they can still refuse to fight, right? The slave can still choose slavery over freedom. And again, there are certainly historical parallels to this. In the American South, during the times of slavery, there were regions, there were provinces where slaves outnumbered whites 10 to 1, if not more, right? I mean, vastly outnumbered whites, but they often still refuse to rebel because that is what slavery does to a person. It doesn't just put shackles on your legs, it also puts them on your mind and on your soul. And that's why for Hegel, the willingness to fight for freedom is so important. For him, it's one of the defining characteristics of what it means to be free. And he writes, this is again from the famous section in the Phenomenology of the Spirit. He says, it is only through staking one's life that freedom is won, right? To be free, to be a free person, you have to be willing to risk it all. And he says the individual has not risked his life, maybe well recognized as a person, but he has not attained to the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness, right? So what he's saying at the end here is the slave, in a sense, is still sort of recognized as a thing to his master, but the recognition that a slave receives from his master is not recognition as being a human being, as being a free human being. because the slave can't be unequal to the master. So the master will never look at the slave as being really worthy of dignity or respect, even as the master might recognize them. For Hegel to be free, one must be willing to fight for it. One must be willing to risk their life for it. Otherwise, it shows that one is subservient to the situation within which one finds themselves. Only one who is willing to risk their life can earn their freedom, because even if they are successful or not, in the moment that they risk their life, they show their refusal to be beholden to anything but their freedom, right? Because if you're not willing to risk your life for Hegel, it's like you're still a slave to your own need to exist, right? Like you're not, it's only when you risk your life that you show that you're not bound by anything. Now, all this being said, what's fascinating is the way that the rabbis seem to agree with Hegel and his criticism of the Exodus story, because they too are deeply bothered by the fact that the Jewish people appear so passive, so dependent on Moshe and God for their liberation. If you remember, Hegel said that the only thing that the Jews did actively to achieve their freedom was stealing from their Egyptian neighbors, which is really not such a wonderful revolutionary act to go steal from somebody. And again, not even to do it with force, but to just say, can we borrow that? And then not return it. Not the act of true revolutionaries. However, Hegel overlooks something important in the narrative, because there is an act that the Jewish people take, an act that they make right before leaving Egypt. On the 10th of Nisan, every Jewish family takes a goat or a lamb, and then on the 14th, they kill it and smear its blood on the doorposts and eat its meat. And for the rabbis, it's this act of the Korban Pesach through which the Jewish people earn their freedom. Because without it, they would remain slaves forever and would not deserve to be taken out of Egypt. For the rabbis, what makes the Korban Pesach so important, so radical, is that it represents the moment when the Jews actively free themselves from their bondage. It is the moment when, as Hegel said, they are staking their lives to win their freedom. So why is this? How did the rabbis see this in the Korban Pesach? So we look here, two midrashim flesh this out in very, very powerful ways. Because the lamb is a symbol of the Egyptian gods, killing the lamb risked bringing Egypt's wrath upon the Jews. Right? Whatever horrors the Jews had experienced up until this point would pale in comparison to what would await them if the Egyptians were able to punish them for their actions. And Moshe himself actually makes this clear earlier in the narrative when he tells Pharaoh the Jewish people cannot worship their God in Egypt. They can't sacrifice to their God in Egypt. It would not be right to do this, Moshe says, for what we sacrifice to the Lord our God is untouchable to the Egyptians, meaning it's the lamb, it's what the Egyptians worship. If we sacrifice that which is untouchable to the Egyptians before their very eyes, will they not stone us? Meaning Moshe's point is, if we try to sacrifice the lamb for God, the Egyptians are going to kill us. And the Midrash echoes this same point, but also makes clear that it's not just that there's risk at stake here, but that this risk is necessary for the Jewish people to earn their freedom. So here's what the Midrash Shemot Rabbah says, and this appears throughout the Mechilta in a variety of different Midrashim. It's a very powerful and important idea for Chazal. On the verse, Mishchu u'chu lachem tzon, draw out and take your lambs. Again, referring that they got to take the Korban Pesach on the 10th of Nisan. When the Holy One, blessed be he, told Moses to slay the Paschal lamb, Moses answered, Lord of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, how can I possibly do this thing? Don't you know that the lamb is the Egyptian god? As it says, again, referring to Moshe's own words here, if we sacrifice the abomination of Egypt before their eyes, will they not stone us? How can we go then sacrifice the lamb in Egypt? But God replies to Moshe, again, the Midrash's version of it, as you live, Israel will not depart from here, from Egypt, before they slaughter the Egyptian gods before their very eyes, that I may teach them that their gods are really nothing at all. This is what he actually did, for on that night, he being God slew the Egyptian firstborn, and on that night, the Israelites slaughtered their Paschal lamb and ate it. One might have thought that slaughtering the lamb would be easy for the Jews. What slave doesn't yearn for the opportunity to tear down the false idols of their masters? But what has to be remembered is that the Jewish people are not yet free. they are still very much in chains. Though their masters have been humbled, the Egyptians still have great power over the Jews. If Pharaoh had once before attempted the mass killing of infants, imagine what would happen if the Jews would rise up and slaughter the gods of Egypt. It would be death and destruction unlike the world had ever before seen. It would be rained upon the Jews. Slaughtering the Korban Pesach is the moment when the Jewish people must act with great courage, right? They got to risk their lives here. As the Midrash elsewhere notes, they must take the lamb on the 10th in full view of their Egyptian masters. They got to keep it in their home for 4 whole days, and then they must slaughter it and then spread the blood on the outside of the doorpost for their masters to see, right? There's no getting around what is to happen here, right? The Jews must act, and they must act in a way that makes clear to everyone where they stand. Are they slaves forever subservient to the Egyptians, or will they act with defiance and show their true freedom? Right? That's the moment here. That's the emancipatory moment where, hey, guys, take a bunch of that. You got to risk your life for freedom. Like without that, nothing really matters. Now, a different midrash makes a similar point, but places a different emphasis, or the emphasis in a different place. Rather than highlighting the physical danger of slaughtering the Korban Pesach, it highlights the psychic danger of doing so, meaning the psychic danger for the Jewish people, for them to actually try to slaughter this lamb. When they kill it, they are not just striking down the Egyptian gods, according to the Midrash, but they are striking down their own gods as well. And here's what the rabbis point out. They note, you will find that when Israel was in Egypt, they served idols, which they were reluctant to abandon. For it says, and this is now citing a verse from Yechezkel, they did not every man cast away the detestable things of their eyes. So from the Midrash's perspective, the Jewish people worshipped idols in Egypt. And while the Torah doesn't say that specifically, we know that not long after the Jewish people leave Egypt, right, there's the famous incident at Har Sinai where they make a golden calf and worship it as a god or as a representation of God. So if they're going to make an idol not long after leaving Egypt, it seems pretty obvious that they probably worshipped idols while they were Egypt. According to some commentators, the calf itself was representative of Egyptian gods. So the Jews worshipped idols in Egypt, and that's a problem for God, right? God says to Moses, as long as Israel worship Egyptian gods, they will not be redeemed. Go out and tell them to abandon their evil ways and reject idolatry. And that's what it means, the Midrash says, when Moshe tells the people, draw out and take your lambs. That is to say, draw away your hands from idolatry and take for yourself lambs. It's ironic here, because by taking the lamb, they're taking the god, but the idea is that by killing the lamb, they are separating themselves from their idols, because they'll be slaying the gods of Egypt and preparing the Passover. Only through this will the Lord pass over you. This is the meaning of, in sitting still and rest, you shall be saved. That again, the Jewish people have to slaughter the Korban Pesach. They have to slaughter their idols if they want to be free. Now, perhaps the greatest evil of slavery, and again, being so far removed from it as a historical phenomenon, we sometimes forget this, but perhaps the greatest evil of slavery is not the physical oppression it inflicts, but rather the cultural annihilation it brings about. The Jews worshiped the gods of Egypt, even though they had a relationship with God all those centuries ago, because a slave cannot help but absorb the culture and the values of their masters. In worshiping the Egyptian gods and their idols, the Jews have become wholly subsumed in an ideological system from which escape appears nearly impossible. One's identity is always intimately bound up with what one worships. As a result, there is no easy way for the Jews to separate from the Egyptian gods and extricate themselves from the culture they embody. Despite the countless evils of Egypt, the Jews simply can't imagine life outside of its cultural coordinates. This is what makes liberation from slavery so hard, if not impossible. To strike down the Egyptian gods, to smash their idols, so to speak, is for the Jews to strike down their own gods. It means that they have to strike at the very things which give their life meaning, perhaps painful meaning, oppressive meaning, but meaning nonetheless. To appreciate this point, again, to see how radical it was for the Jews to slaughter the Korban Pesach, for them to slaughter their idols, you have their own idols. You have to understand the true depths of slavery that the Jewish people found themselves. And it's helpful to look at a comment by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch on an important phrase that repeats in Shemot. Right? One of the phrases, one of the descriptions of Egypt is that it's repeatedly called Beit Avadim, a house of slavery, or the sort of the old school English translation, the house of bondage, right? The Jews were in the house of bondage. But this is it sounds just like strange to us, and it was also strange as a grammatical expression. It's really not clear what the Torah means when it describes Egypt as a house of bondage. Obviously, it was a place of slavery for the Jews, but there seems to be more going on here. So for Hirsch, the expression Beit Avadim is a description not of Egypt per se, like its political structure or anything like that, but of the Jewish people's experience in Egypt. And here's how Hirsch understands it. He says, from the house of bondage, that we were going to be redeemed from the house of bondage. The house of bondage is a home. And in it, the father and mother and all their descendants were slaves. Such were their homes in Egypt. They were slaves from birth there. So Hirsch's point here is that Egypt was a house of bondage for the Jews because all the Jews were slaves there. To be born a Jew was to be born a slave. You were born into a family, Jewish family, but your mother was a slave and your father was a slave, right? That's why it's a house of bondage. Everybody in the family, everybody in the home is a slave. And Hirsch adds to this in another comment. He says, the land of Egypt was for us a house of bondage, and in it, we were slaves from birth. The negation of our freedom, as brought about by the might of the Egyptian hand, caused it so that freedom was forgotten from the hearts of the Jews. Slavery was considered to be our natural position. You see, by the time Moshe arrives with God's message of liberation, all Jews had forgotten what it meant to be free. For them, the natural position of the Jew was to be a slave in Egypt. There simply wasn't any alternative. Being free wasn't something they could imagine, that it was something that was just out there waiting for them. Just they had to overcome certain obstacles in order to reach it. For the Jews, freedom was impossible. To ask the Jews in Egypt to slaughter their gods, again, meant basically asking them to imagine a future that simply didn't exist. It'd be like asking us to take that which we think to be of ultimate importance and just like destroy it and just be like, okay, you can do this. Now, again, if you want to just use a sort of a common example, right? Think for a moment. Imagine a man comes and he promises to be Mashiach, and he's even able to do these signs and wonders that make you think maybe this guy is really the Mashiach, and he promises that God will redeem you and this unfortunate world. If only you will take all your money out of the bank, every last penny of it, and then you got to put it in a big pile, and you got to set it on fire, burning all of it, right? And if you do this, you'll be redeemed, right? If that's what the Mashiach come and said, right? How many of us would really be rushing to do such a thing? But I think most of us consider doing this to be nothing short of self-destruction, because if we really destroyed all our money, how would we be able to function as human beings, right? Money is the currency that shapes our world, that helps us provide meaning and structure to our lives. You take that away, right? What's left? So to help us better understand this point about, again, just the radicality of the Jews slaughtering the lamb, destroying their own gods, their own source of meaning, I want to turn to two secular philosophers who I think can help us understand this a little bit more. The first is Emmanuel Kant, who's a predecessor of Hegel's, probably the greatest philosopher of the last few hundred years. He's a bit older than Hegel, and much of Hegel's philosophy is a response to Kant. He's German as well. And like Hegel, Kant also celebrated the French Revolution, because Kant also thought freedom was very, very important. Kant writes 3 famous critiques, and the second critique is dedicated to the question of freedom. Because again, you can look at the world and say, humans aren't really free, right? Everything has a cause to it, right? We're all just kind of like automatons, like kind of just doing what we're programmed to. But Kant wants to argue vehemently that human beings can be free. And again, he celebrates the French Revolution because he sees it as a important step forward in human beings achieving freedom. But at a certain point, what's interesting is that Kant becomes horrified by the French Revolution. Now, if you're familiar with history, what's interesting is that Kant wasn't horrified so much by the terror, which is the term used for when the revolutionaries put many people to death, but specifically was horrified when the revolution put the king on trial, King of France, found him guilty and sentenced him to death. So why did this horrify Kant? Well, he says as follows. He says that this is from the Metaphysics of Morals. It's Kant's sort of philosophy. It's his political philosophy, basically, that's drawing on his earlier ethical and critical philosophy. He says the dethronement of a monarch can still be thought of as if he had voluntarily laid aside the crown. Now, because you might think that Kant doesn't like the idea of revolution, it's violent, right? Isn't that a problem? But he says here that he can imagine a situation where a monarch abdicates the throne and he gives his authority back to the people, or as if without any attack on the highest person, he'd relinquished his authority and been reduced to the rank of a private person. Kant's point is that a king can abdicate the throne, give their power to the people, and that, he argues, would be appropriate under the right circumstances because it could lay the groundwork for democracy of some kind. And Kant even goes on here, he's not even bothered so much by the idea of assassinating the king. And he goes on to say that this even could be justified under certain circumstances. He says, of all the atrocities involved in overthrowing a state by rebellion, the assassination of the monarch is not itself the worst, right? The worst thing you can do is not necessarily kill the king. For we can still think of people as doing it from fear that if he remained alive, he could marshal his forces and inflict on them the punishment they deserve. So their killing him would not be an enactment of punitive justice, but merely a dictate of self-preservation. Meaning, if the king's a tyrant, and there is fear that letting him live might endanger the lives of many, then Kant argues killing the king could be justified, if only for the sake of preventing a greater loss of life later on. But what bothers Kant here is not just the killing of the king, but putting the king on trial, finding him guilty, and then sentencing him to death. And Kant goes on here, he says, the reason for horror at the thought of the formal execution of a monarch by his people is therefore this: his execution must be regarded as a complete overturning of the principles of the relation between a sovereign and his people. There's something that almost like goes against the laws of nature here for Kant when the people killed the sovereign this way, in which the people, which owes its existence only to the sovereign's legislation, makes itself his master, so that the violence is elevated above the most sacred rights, brazenly and in accordance with a principle. Like a chasm that irretrievably swallows everything, the execution of a monarch seems to be a crime from which the people cannot be absolved, or it as if the state commits suicide, right? There's almost something nihilistic here for Kant when the people killed the king, right? It's like the state is basically destroying itself. And that horrifies Kant. And the reason for this is the king represents the people. In fact, the king doesn't just represent the people, the king embodies the people. It's the living embodiment of the people. And because of this, the king is the sovereign, right? The king embodies the authority of the state. To find the king guilty and kill him is an effect for the state to cut off its own head. Now, this sounds strange to you, that again, the Kant would look at it in this way. All you have to do is look at England today. Because if there's one thing that the British people are mourning with the loss of Queen Elizabeth, it's the loss of a unifying figure who embodied this fictional idea called England, called the United Kingdom. Right? There are literally millions waiting hours, if not days, in line to pay their respects because of what she meant to them, right? That shows you the power of the monarch and in the symbolic, reality of the people. Her death is a national tragedy because she is not just the symbol of the state, she embodies the state. She is England in a sense. That is the role of the monarch, right? So to sentence the monarch to death and to kill them, again, it's like cutting off your own head here. Now, what Kant failed to recognize when the French Revolution sentenced their king to death is that revolutions are always radical. They always bring radical transformation if they're successful. If a revolution means more than just reshuffling who is in charge, which I hate to say it is what happens with most revolutions get rid of the masters so the revolutionaries can become the new masters, right? That's the story of history, certainly the story of many liberation movements of the last two centuries. If a revolution, though, means more than just changing who's in charge, then the oppressive structure which previously existed must come to a complete end. And that's what's signified by the people putting the king on trial and sentencing him to death. What the Jews did in Egypt is really no different. In order to allow for the possibility of something new to emerge, for the structures of meaning which have previously existed for the Jews, they have to come to an end. right? And the idols, again, that represents the sovereign authority, right? They are the embodiments of the people, of the state, right? The living, the physical embodiment. You can point to them just like you can point to the monarch, right? To destroy them means destroying their gods and bringing an end to basically the state as it can be understood by the Jews. But it's the only way to bring something new into being. And I want to just add one more point to appreciate this, that revolutions have to be this radical. You have to like literally kill the head of the state, kill your own gods. When you grow up in America, you learn a lot about the American Revolution. Like when I was in elementary school, I felt like I learned about it every year. And what you're taught about the American Revolution is how important it is, how influential it was, how it brought about the first modern republic, a nation for the people, by the people, where all of its citizens have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Growing up, you don't typically learn much about the French Revolution. And to the extent that you do learn about it, what's usually emphasized are its excesses, how it became authoritarian for a time. And that's a shame, in my opinion, because if you ask me, the Exodus has a lot more in common with the French Revolution than it does with the American Revolution. Why is this? Because the American Revolution did not really bring freedom, at least not for everyone. There were slaves in America before the revolution, and there remained slaves afterwards. The French Revolution, however, brought about a total transformation of society. And you can actually see the similarity between the Exodus and the French Revolution when you look closely. For the Jews, the Exodus creates the inauguration of a new calendar, right? The Jews start tracking time from when they left Egypt. Nisan becomes the first month of the year in the Torah. So too, the French Revolution created a new calendar with new months, which serve as a radical break from the Christian Gregorian calendar, which previously structured the year. And again, the way you mark time means if you are starting time anew, it is a new beginning. It's a total rupture, a break with everything that came before it. Furthermore, the Talmud Yerushalmi has this fascinating line where it states that when the Jews, when God gave the Jews their very first mitzvah, it wasn't just Kiddush HaChodesh, sanctifying the new month, but it included another mitzvah as well. The Jews had to free their own slaves. Right? It's sort of a strange thing the Yerushalmi says, but it seems to imply that the Jews as slaves also had slaves. But what God is telling the Jewish people, if you have slaves, you have to free them before you can leave Egypt. And so too, after the French Revolution, France eliminated slavery in France and in all French colonies around the world, because a real revolution means a total break with what came before, and freedom not just for some, but ultimately freedom for all. I want to turn to one more thinker, secular thinker, to help us think through the radical act of liberation that the Jews took when slaughtering the Korban Pesach. And it's a very powerful quote from Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian philosopher and cultural theorist who draws heavily on psychoanalysis. And in my opinion, if you want to understand liberation or emancipation as a political process, you have to understand the sort of psychoanalytic, psychic side of it. And what's fascinating is how front and center the Torah puts that dimension of liberation, right? Because again, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, it's all about the people's state of mind, right? Liberation, the relationship with God, it is all about their state of mind. The Torah emphasizes that again and again and again, which means we have to understand that if we're going to understand what liberation is all about. And he offers, I think, sort of an account for what he calls the political act, a transformative political act. But you'll see it captures very powerfully what happened for the Jews when they had to slaughter the Korban Pesach. And you can see how his own words echo the Midrashim we previously saw, that the Jewish people must risk their life and their very identity when they strike down the Egyptian gods. So here's what Žižek says. He says the act, and when he says the act, he means like a political, radical, revolutionary act. He says it differs from an active intervention, an action, in that it radically transforms its bearer, the agent. The act is not something I simply accomplish, not simply something I accomplish. After an act, I am literally not the same as before. So for Žižek, the revolutionary act, the radical act, it changes you, it transforms you. The you were when you did it is not the you are afterwards. In this sense, he continues, we could say that the subject, the person, undergoes the act. They pass through it rather than accomplish it. In it, the subject is annihilated and subsequently reborn, or not. But not every radical act of liberation works out exactly the way we want, he's noting here. It's not always a guarantee that when you risk your life, when you risk everything, you're going to come out of it the other side the way you want. The act involves a kind of temporary eclipse and aphanesis, which is a Greek word for disappearance of the subject, meaning in the radical act, the liberatory act, emancipatory act, it's like yourself disappears. By destroying their idols, we know this for the Jews, which serve as the source of their identity, the Jewish people will not be the same afterwards. Because again, the idol is what in part grants them their identity. They were slaves in Egypt, right? They worshiped the Egyptian gods. They were, for all intents and purposes, Egyptians, other than the fact they bore the name Jew. But once they slaughter those idols, there's no going back. That whole world, that identity is lost to them. Just as the French could never be the same after they put their king on trial and sentenced him to death, right? There's just no going back for that. It's a rupture, which is why Zizek continues, every act worthy of this name is mad in the sense of radical unaccountability. There's something, there's always something transgressive about it. By means of it, I put at stake everything, including myself, my symbolic identity. The act is therefore always a crime, a transgression of the limits of the symbolic community to which I belong. And again, you hear the echoes here of the Midrashim, right? The transformative, radical, liberatory act is always transgressive in the context that it takes place. In this case, it's transgressive to the Egyptians, right? It is the most transgressive thing you could do in Egypt at that time. For Egypt, when the Jews slaughter the Korban Pesach, it is the greatest crime possible. There's nothing worse you can do than kill another people's gods. And if you don't believe me, just remember the Jews have been accused of it, of killing God by Christians for thousands of years. It's not the kind of thing people forgive and forget, right? This is the worst. This is the greatest transgression. This breaks the political system, the religious political structure that you're in. The act is defined by this irreducible risk in its most fundamental dimension. It is always negative, meaning you can't calculate this. You can't do this knowing what it's going to be like on the other side. Because if you did, it wouldn't be emancipatory. It would just be like a pragmatic act. Like, oh, like I can strategize and do this and then get this outcome. This kind of act totally escapes that kind of logic. He says it's always negative, an act of annihilation, of wiping out. We not only don't know what will come out of it, its final outcome is ultimately even insignificant, strictly secondary in relation to the no of the pure act. That's what the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach is. It is a pure no in Zizek's language. It is like sticking your middle finger, an act of defiance directed at Egypt. And for the Jews who know nothing but slavery, it is also an act of violence at their very sense of self. Because to be truly free, they must risk death along with their own identity, the only identity that has ever given their lives meaning. Why must they do this? Because freedom always requires sacrifice. True liberation can only be experienced as a profound rupture, and that is what always makes it appear impossible to those who are enslaved. That's the thing we forget. To the slave, freedom is impossible. It just can't happen. But what the story of the Exodus reminds us is that the impossible can happen if we are willing to make the sacrifice. The chain around the slave's ankle may restrict her movement, but she always retains the ability to cut off her foot. And in doing so, she makes clear to herself and to others that being bound to her master is not destiny. To be human is to forever bear the potential of being free, no matter what circumstances one is born into, if only one is willing to pay the cost. Now, if we are not sure this is true, all we have to actually do is look at the example of Moshe Rabbeinu, because he goes through the same exact experience that Zizek is describing here, that the Jewish people have to experience when slaughtering the Korban Pesach. However, Moshe's moment of choice, his act, comes much earlier in the story, when he sees the Egyptian mercilessly beating a Jewish slave, because in that instant, he chooses to act, and by striking down the Egyptian and killing him, he acts freely, but he risks everything, right? Not only does he risk everything, he appears to actually lose everything. It's his act of great transgression. He kills the Egyptian, Pharaoh wants to kill him. His crime, Moshe's crime, forces him to flee Egypt and all that he knows. He is not the same in the aftermath of it. Moshe, who was the prince of Egypt, that Moshe dies the moment he strikes down the Egyptian. And the Moshe who returns to Egypt to lead the Jewish people to freedom is a changed man, and most importantly, a free man. All of this really kind of helps explain perhaps the most powerful biblical verses about the Jewish people's liberation from Egypt, several of which appear in the Haggadah. These verses, they're from Sefer Chezkel, and when you read them in the Haggadah, it's always like, what's going on here? What's talking about? What they describe is the Jewish people leaving Egypt. And that experience is as if God comes across them as a newborn infant, abandoned just minutes after its birth. It makes sense to understand the night of Korban Pesach as a birth or a rebirth of the Jewish people. And again, when you think about the context, the birthing imagery is everywhere, right? They are in their homes, right, throughout the night, right? They hear the screams around them as the firstborn Egyptians are being struck down and killed. And only in the morning, the Jews leave their homes. And as they leave, they walk between their doorposts, which are both splattered with blood. So you have like the screaming and the pain that goes on for hours. Then there's the moment of birth as they pass through the doorway with the blood on either side. In leaving Egypt, Yechezkel describes the Jews as an infant no one has cared for, that the infant's unwashed, unclothed, its umbilical cord is still intact, because that's the condition we were in after slaughtering the Korban Pesach. That's what liberation means. It means being born again. It means an end of all that came before, right? Which again, it's messy, it's bloody, it's painful. Because again, but at the end of the day, to be born again is to experience the possibility of something new. And as every mother knows, and every father knows too, childbirth is painful. It's painful for the mother and the baby, and it changes both mother and baby forever. In the moment when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were little more than screaming infants, but they finally had the potential to be free, something that was completely impossible as long as they remained in Egypt. I'll just read two of the verses here. And again, as I said, they're in the Haggadah. He said, God speaking through the prophet, he says, as for your birth, when you were born, your navel cord was not cut. Your umbilical cord was still attached, and you were not bathed in water to smooth you. You were not rubbed with salt, nor were you swaddled. Meaning the Jewish people were a screaming infant covered in blood and basically not cared for. That's what the experience was like as they left Egypt. Right? This is the experience of after the Korban Pesach, because in some ways it is a self-destruction that leads to a rebirth. But it doesn't leave the Jewish people in this triumphant state. No one pitied you enough to do any of those things for you out of compassion for you. On the day you were born, you were left lying rejected in the open field. But God says, when I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, these are the famous lines. We also say this at Brit Milah, right? Live in spite of your blood. Yes, I said to you, live in spite of your blood. And what's powerful here is this idea of chayi, right? Like this, you got to live, right? Like this is the moment you come out the other side, right? You're wallowing in the remnants of what was there, but God is giving this injunction to live, right? To embrace life, to embrace freedom. Now, I'm sure some of you are listening to all of this and thinking to yourselves, wow, this sounds awfully extreme. All this talk about radicality, transformation, liberation, right? Self-annihilation, right? Freedom requires this kind of sacrifice. Like, why would anybody want it, right? It sounds impossible. When the moment comes, how could any of us be willing to risk so much as the Jewish people did? So I think it's important to understand that the moments of liberation, the act of liberation for the Jewish people in general is never a solitary endeavor. Every Jew wasn't asked to slaughter a Korban Pesach on their own, right? Rather, families did it together, right? In the fight for freedom, we always stand alongside and act on behalf of others. Because the Talmud says this in Masechet Brachot, a prisoner can never free himself from his own prison. We can't emancipate ourselves. There is no such thing as self-emancipation. We all need the help of others. And even in leaving Egypt, right? Each Jew was not called upon to slaughter this lamb by themselves, right? They did it for and with others. If the Jewish people are able to slaughter the Korban Pesach and actually achieve this whole radical act of freedom, it is because Moshe has shown them that one can stand up to Pharaoh and live. It's because Aaron has found the strength to utter words no Jew has been able to say before. It's because God has made clear that Egypt and its gods, its idols, are not as all-powerful as they claim to be. The Jewish people will slaughter the Korban Pesach because even though they may not live to see the promised land, they will fight nonetheless. So perhaps at least their children need not grow up in chains. And I think all of this, again, is not just a question of how we read Chumash. It has a profound importance for us as well. And again, everything I'm talking about, radical transformation, emancipation, right? All of this applies to tshuva as well, because that's what tshuva is. It is about transformation. It's about liberating oneself from the enslavement of sin. So this is as applicable now as it is for Pesach. Every year at the Seder, we open the Magid section with the words Hashta Avde L'Shana Ba'a B'nei Chorin. This year we are slaves, and next year we will be free. And again, that's the mindset we bring into Rosh Hashanah as well, right? That we are sort of enslaved and trapped by our sins, these ways that we can't escape, but we yearn to be free. And that should always be a reminder to us that just as our ancestors did not achieve complete and total freedom completely that moment they left Egypt, all right, it was still a process, right? You need that break, but you got to work for it afterwards for generations. The Jewish people are still working towards their freedom, right? We still sing in Hatikva, Liyotam Chovshi Be'artzeinu, right? Well, why are we singing that? We're here now. It's not something we yearn for, but again, freedom is something that always is maybe just one step beyond us that we have to fight for. And what the story of the Exodus makes clear again and again is that the fight for freedom isn't easy, but it is possible as long as we recognize that the radical act of freedom is always available to us, as impossible, as hard as it might be. Because there will come a moment, and the question is, can you take it? Recognizing that what makes it so hard is you won't be the same on the other side. So I think we will conclude here. I saw how they asked for slavery, right? Even in a more humanized form, right? Like, so that is a really important question. I will say this, obviously the Torah doesn't enable any kind of sort of national slavery or wholesale slavery in the ways of chattel slavery in the full dimensions that are being, seemingly talked about here in Egypt. I think on a certain level, because again, like there's also this whole question of the fact that we're supposed to be slaves to God. So what all this gets at is, again, slavery and freedom is not obvious or simple, and that it can't be reduced to simple questions of like, do I have a master or not? So yeah, that is an important question, because the moment we leave Egypt, it's not like the Jewish people are free, and it's not like the Torah presents this vision of total equality and freedom. But it's not chattel slavery in the sense that you can enslave a people. Like I was thinking in terms of the Jews, or even in terms of like African Americans in America. But it was chattel slavery in certain sense. But again, so this is a complicated question. Like it's not a simple question, and I don't think the Torah is of one mind completely on this. But I think in terms of the way we read the Exodus story is that model of what it means to really be liberated or emancipated, and the radicality of it, is something that we have to hold on to. Thank you, everyone.